Välkommen allesammen. Didn't want to make this video, but too many dumb comments lately. I'm gonna have to go over the actual sources on this, guys. I'm sorry to say, Vikings, the TV show, is not a historical source of Norse culture, okay? Also, besides using Netflix as a historical source, the second biggest mistake that modern day pagans very often do to determine what kind of Old Norse values and beliefs were like is that they will take Christianity, Christian values, and then they'll just do the complete opposite of that and call that pagan and assume that that was automatically pagan belief 1,000 years ago. Just because Christianity of the Middle Ages was against certain things such as same-sex relations, infidelity, divorce, multiple partners, orgies, or promiscuity in general, people just automatically assume that pagans were in support of all those things, which is not true. So I'm going over all those sources in this video. Look, I'm not saying I agree with any of this. I'm not saying I agree with the Old Norse view on sexuality. I'm not trying to forward some sort of sexually conservative agenda. The only agenda I have ever had and argued on this channel is truth and freedom. That's the only agenda I will ever have. Everyone should sleep with whoever they want. Be free. I had a hoe phase too. I liked to party when I was younger. And I don't want to be a virgin till married, and I don't want to keep women locked away until their father chooses their husbands and marries them off. I don't want any of these things. I don't agree with a lot of the views on sex that were there in the Viking Age. But that doesn't mean it's just okay to put your modern values and make up lies about our ancestors. That's why I'm making this video on the sources. And as also, as much as I believe in freedom, be free to express yourself, sleep with whoever you like, but at the same time, actions have consequences. And if we want to live a promiscuous and free life, that's fine. But we have to be honest about the consequences for these things, and I think we will learn a thing or two from the Viking Age about that. So first, let's start off here. The only natural start we can do with the oldest source that speaks about the Germanic peoples, long before the Viking Age, when we were essentially all one people. At least in the Romans' eyes, they considered us all one people. And look at this. The matrimonial bond was strict. There was nothing more honorable in their society than picking one partner and sticking with them through all kinds of troubles and even danger. They lived in chastity, corrupted by no seductive spectacles like the Romans did, for example, at the time. But please note that these Roman things, you know, the orgies and the prostitution and the sex shows, that was originally not part of Roman culture. Don't get it twisted. That's something that developed with Rome when they got to their peak, the biggest civilization, really in the centuries and generations leading up to their collapse, I might add. But just note that was not always a part of Rome and Southern European culture. Also, you'll see here how rare adultery was among the Germanic peoples and how harshly it was punished. Also, you will see at the bottom there how only virgins married, and if you were a prostitute or just a hoe that slept around in general, you would never marry because that was the most shameful thing you can do. Now, before you get all pissed off, ladies, this didn't just apply to women. This is not an attack on women. Men would be celibate too until marriage. Another great quote here, not in just one, but two sources of the time. Here they believed that young men abstaining from sex would make them more powerful, and it would be even considered shameful to have sex before age 20. So there you have it. The Norse and the all the other Germanic peoples, the ancestors where they descended from, nothing was more valuable and honorable than celibacy and loyalty to one partner, and nothing was more shameful than promiscuous behavior among men and women alike. We're going to see some of the same types of things about 600-700 years later in the Viking Age, more or less. The only exception, of course, was the highest status men like kings, chieftains, for various reasons, could take multiple wives or had concubines or had some other extracurricular activities outside of the marriage. This is not just a Germanic thing or Norse thing, this is a human thing. Not trying to sound like Andrew Tate here, but it's true. All of humanity has been like that to a certain degree. Where I disagree with that, though, it's not like one way or another. It's kind of on a spectrum, okay? The more difficult a culture is to survive in at different times, different places in the world, the closer humans get to their traditional gender roles and monogamy, and the more advanced and comfortable a society gets, and the more materialistic it gets, the more promiscuous and hypergamous and polygamous that society gets. In tribal places, such as the Germanic tribes and other tribal places around the world, it's pretty much all kind of like monogamy and loyalty to one partner and no sexual taboos going on. In the same time in Rome, for example, very advanced, societal, big city, civilization, materialistic. Guess what? People turn into hoes, and the men at the top class of society are cleaning up, getting all the women, and the regular men don't get any. Most of the women are sleeping around trying to land a man from the highest class, usually unsuccessfully. Guess which age we are in today. Not saying it's wrong or right, just explaining the cycles in history. Now the Viking Age, they'd have been somewhere around here, not quite halfway to Rome, but not quite all the way to a tribal society either. Not completely civilized and degenerate like the worst parts of the Roman age would have been. First, let's dispel this myth about women's marriage and their partner choice. So the idea in the Viking Age that the women were all feminist, liberated, girl power, blah blah blah, whatever, all these things that people are saying, things that you see in the TV show. Yes, it's true for the time period. Women in Scandinavia had more rights and more freedoms than anywhere else in Europe at the time. Yes, that's true. But they couldn't just go around sleeping with whoever they wanted. The father had the say in who she married and who she slept with, okay? If the father wasn't around to approve of the marriage, it would have been another man in her life. It would have been her brother, her cousin, her son. Or if a woman had no living male family members, it would be a religious leader or Godi that had to approve and sign off as in her marriage, as was done in Vatnsdæla Saga. So a woman had to get approval from some male in her life if she wanted to get with any guy. In fact, in the Grágás law codes, one of the oldest law codes we have from the north of Europe, if a man sleeps with a free woman with a permanent residence, the penalty is full outlawry, basically denoting that if a man slept with a free woman without the permission of the man on the estate, the one who was staying with, a brother, father, brother, cousin, whatever, that guy would be in deep trouble, whether or not the woman was willing to sleep with him. This is mentioned in every single account of a marriage in the Viking Age. You had to get approval of the man in her life. However, don't get too mad, ladies. Almost every time in the sources, the father definitely did ask for the daughter's opinion in who she wanted to marry. It wasn't necessary, but most fathers in all the sources we have made sure their daughter liked the guy actually before he married her off to him. We have a couple very rare occasions. There are a couple that I know of where a woman did sneakily get married without her father's approval. In Olav the Saint's saga, a princess of Sweden married the Norwegian king against her father's wishes, but she still had to have one of her male companions smuggle her out of Sweden, basically, and give her away for the marriage. That smuggler ended up being hanged for his treachery, but yeah, at least some man had to approve and give the woman away at a marriage. We also have a few examples of wooing in the sagas. These are all in Heimskringla pretty much, basically in royal sagas, the king sagas, especially princesses. if there was no clear choice of who the man she would be chosen to marry would be, then her father, the king, would allow suitors to come and court her, and he would let her choose the one that he wanted. Does this mean she got to go around to all the barnyard dances and get drunk and have sex with each suitor and give him a test drive before she decided the one to marry? No. The suitor would maybe do some things like taking her on a walk through the courtyard, or stayed at the house for a feast for a couple days, supervised by the king, supervised PG behavior. And if word got out that the princess or any woman had been sleeping around town, her reputation would be tarnished and no one would want to marry her anyway. So this is not something that happened, like any other culture in history too. And it would be the same thing today, guys, if it wasn't for a little invention called birth control and Hollywood media celebrating this behavior. So just be aware of that. This is not some luxury that humans ever had before in history. Next, let's talk about divorce. Another myth we have to bust. The idea that women could just get married and divorced whenever the hell they wanted. True, yes, women in Scandinavia were allowed to ask for a divorce. They were allowed to initiate a divorce. And they definitely were not allowed to initiate divorce in any other place in Europe at the time, as Spanish-Arabic traveler Al-Tarkushi was astonished to observe in Denmark in the 900s that women could actually initiate a divorce. But even in the Viking world, divorce was only permitted under a small handful of situations. I did a whole video about those sources, but I'm just going over them quickly here. The only occasions where a woman could get a divorce. One, if a man traveled abroad and didn't return home to bed his wife for 3 years, then she could get a divorce. Two, if a man tried to take his wife out of the country against her will, she could also divorce him in that case. So big focus on not being taken away from her family and kin there. Three, if a man slapped his wife not once, not twice, but 3 times, she could legally ask for a divorce. Number 4, a man could only divorce his wife because of domestic violence if she caused something called meira sad metis, or great wounds translated. Basically wounds near death, pretty much. Number 5, infidelity, of course, was grounds for divorce, but only female infidelity was grounds for divorce, that the man could divorce her. This is mentioned in various law codes. The only way a man would get in trouble for infidelity is if he slept with someone else's wife. Well, that doesn't exactly sound fair, does it? Men can cheat and women can't. Oh, well, you know what else isn't fair? Next one, number 6. A woman could divorce her husband if he did something and he lost his wealth. Look, the man maybe hit some bad luck, he lost his business, maybe he got his house raided or burnt down and now he's broke. He's at his most vulnerable and he needs his family the most, and his wife can just leave him and take the kids. That doesn't sound very fair either, so there's double standards on both sides. Number 7 and final reason for divorce is if a female wore pants, or if a man wore a short-cut shirt. Basically, if you could prove that your husband or wife was gay or not fulfilling some gender roles, that would be grounds for divorce. That's it. That's the only reasons. 7 of them recorded all over Scandinavia and Iceland for over hundreds of years. It could be even less of those, depending on the time and place. So 7 reasons, maximum, probably even less. You could not just divorce your partner because you had grown apart or irreconcilable differences. No. You stuck with your partner unless it was an extreme case. Let's talk about remarriage. One of the only ways that a woman would really end up having more than one sexual partner in her whole life is if she remarried. This was considered acceptable in certain circumstances, and the woman would not lose any honor because of it. Where we see it most often is among royalty. Like if the king died, like in Njáls Saga or also Sogubrot, they're different sagas, but they tell the same story of this. There was a princess named Egils, she got married away by her father to a king named Rörik. But she really, in reality, preferred Rörik's brother Helgi and wanted to marry him. Her father, Ivar, had plans basically to put both brothers against each other so he could conquer their kingdoms. So he took advantage of the situation and he told Rörik that his daughter Auður was unfaithful and she slept with his brother Helgi. Some battles happened and both men ended up dying. And Auður, after that, a bit later, travels to the east and remarries with a king of Gaidariki named Hroðbarðr. This Gaidariki was kind of like Russia area. Another little fun fact here. Auður, even when she remarried, she had already been married and her husband died, she was about to get married again, she had to get permission from a man in her life. Her father, of course, didn't approve, but she had a son from her previous marriage named Harald, and it was Harald who actually gave permission for his mother to remarry, and he gave her away. So there are a few other examples in the sagas like this of a woman remarrying, especially if it was royalty. This was pretty normal if a wife's prince or king died. These marriages happened again, but these were not necessarily out of love or desire. They were more about political alliances. So yes, in that case, it might have been somewhat normal for a woman to remarry if her king husband died in those situations. For regular people, it definitely could have happened too, but there would have been much less motivation to wife up a single mother, because especially at the time, we do see had happened on occasion though. One of my favorite examples is in Egils Saga. Egil actually married the wife of his brother Turolf. Turolf, his wife's name was Åsgerd, but Turolf died in a battle, and it was agreed upon by Turolf and his brother Egil that Egil would take his wife if he ever died. So this is what drove me crazy on the Vikings TV show, if you remember that scene, because that's what they based this load of garbage on.
Why are you looking at us like that? I don't think it's fair that I should keep Margaret to myself.
They say that brothers can share women. Why? Because we are Vikings.
How can you not be jealous?
Because we are Vikings.
Oh. Nobody was trying to cross swords or stir their brother's porridge, okay? If you had a wife and kids and you died, it was maybe common to have your brother or maybe other family member marry your widowed wife. Like, yeah, of course, I want my wife to remarry someone after I die, so she's taken care of. But instead of some random guy, why not let it be my brother? At least I'll trust him with my kids. So that's where that comes from, and we have a couple other examples like that of women remarrying a husband's close family. Now, let's get on to some examples of hoes. Don't get mad yet, ladies, because in just a minute I'm gonna go over another section called man hoes. But here we are speaking about examples of promiscuous women. Guys, I wish there were more sources for this, but there really, really isn't. I wish in the sagas there were some examples of promiscuous women who slept around, because then we could learn a thing or two about the perception of those women and what it was. But I'm just not aware of any sagas that go into detail on that. It seems to be something that just didn't exist, women who sleep around. If you know of any examples of that, you can write it down below in the comments. But first, I'll touch on the myths. The myths of goddesses being promiscuous. These don't count. How about in Lokasenna, when Siv is said to cheat on her husband Thor, and Freya had apparently slept with everyone around? Or how about in the tale Sörla, when Freya went to the dwarves, and she let the dwarves run a train on her in exchange for a golden necklace? Guys, I hope you know by watching this channel for now, the gods weren't real humans. The myths are symbolic, the myths weren't real events, and they most certainly are not a blueprint of what humans base their ethics and values on. If you want to make that argument, okay. If you want to make that argument that the myths, the mythology, is something we should base our ethics on, then you have to take all parts of the myths, okay? And not just the ones that fit your agenda. Yeah, Siv slept around, she cheated on Thor. so it's okay for me to do that, right? Oh, Freya had sex with a lot of men, so it's okay if I do that, right? Okay, Loki was gender fluid and had sex with a horse. Oh yeah, it's okay for me to do that too. Oh, okay. Oh, so you say it's okay, we can just do everything the gods did, huh? Is that what you're saying? Can we force a woman to marry us against her will, like Freyr did in Skirnismal? Can we have one of our friends hold down a woman by force while we have sex with her against her will, just like Odin and Thor did in Harbardslud? No, you don't like those very much, do you? Yeah, me neither. I don't like that. So again, like I said, we can't use the actions of the gods in the myths to base our ethics and values of, and they did not do that in the Viking Age either. So I will go over a couple of real historical sources of hoes. Like I said, mentions of women sleeping around are just not anywhere. In fact, women having sex with a man out of wedlock is even difficult to find, but there are a couple. In the saga of Harald Fairhair, who by the way was a major man-ho, I'll speak about that in a minute. But here, the King Harald was at a Yule feast, and he met a beautiful chieftain's daughter named Snæfríður. Harald wanted to bang her, and Snæfríður wanted to bang him too. She was itching for a sticking, actually. But her father, Svási, stepped in, and he would not allow his daughter to be a concubine. So Harald agreed to marry her. That was his 12th wife, probably. He had so many. So even a king would struggle to bed a high-class woman coming from a good family without a marriage. Harald could bang slaves and servants and stuff, but no honorable woman would spread her legs, even for a king, unless there was a marriage involved. Another story in Helgathattir, a rare example of a woman sleeping with a man out of wedlock. And the story kind of blends myth and reality, but generally most parts of the story are believed to be historical. But a man named Helgi is traveling to Finnmark, and he meets a king's daughter named Ingebjörg, and she lets Helgi sleep with her for 3 nights, and then he just leaves, and she even gives him some presents, okay? So that is one of the only examples of a high-class woman sleeping with a man out of wedlock. Those are just 2 examples. If you know of any others of women sleeping around, one-night stands or having multiple partners, right below in the comments. I just don't know of any like that. Finally, while we're still on the subject of women, we need to speak about slaves, concubines, and prostitutes, because this is pretty much the only women who would be having, sex out of wedlock, pretty much. First of all, we have a grand total of 0 reliable records that prostitution was ever a thing in Scandinavia before modern times. Matter of fact, the only source that we have that mentions anything of the kind is a late 17th century text, supposedly copied from older saga material, but we're just not sure. But in there it says that Harald Fairhair made prostitution illegal, and that was outlawed. You could actually be hunted down and killed if you engaged in any prostitution. At the time of Harald Fairhair, this was the early Viking Age, so even if this is a reliable source, and it did exist in Scandinavia before that, it was outlawed in the early Viking Age, warranting the harshest punishment. There's one more kind of source in Gesta Danorum. Again, it's not regarded as a fully factual part of this text, but it mentions a story about Lagertha and Ragnar in here. And here it says that the Swedish king Frö, after he defeated the Norwegian king in battle, he put the women of his family into a brothel to humiliate them, to which Ragnar, later in the story, rescued them. And it's regarded there as a legendary, source and not real events, but I did think I would include that. So prostitution, basically non-existent, but it may have existed some point in time, but not in the Viking Age. We have no other mentions of it. Then, aside from prostitutes, let's talk about concubines, side chicks, my favorite. The Old Norse fridla, they were called, meaning concubine or mistresses. We actually find this word in law codes that have to do with like inheritance in the Old Norse world. A child from a concubine, they had a lot more rights than the bastard children, as they were called in other parts of Europe at the time. And they even distinguished different types of children born out of wedlock. Hornunger, risunger, and even a son born from a slave woman. And these all had varying degrees to rights on inheritance. If the man recognized him as a child and freed him by a certain time, like you see here. Another law in the law code, Gulathing, saying that a man sleeps with a concubine for 20 whole years, then the child would be recognized and he would have rights to the inheritance. And sometimes even a child born from a slave gained great honor and pride from the father. Just like in Vatnsdæla Saga, when Kjartan is born and, he forced a sexual relation on the slave, Medkorka, who turned out to be a princess, we find later on. So that definitely did happen. Also in the oldest law code we have the Grágás laws. If a man had a child from a concubine, he didn't have any children from his legal wife, then the concubine child could inherit everything. This actually happened when Magnus the Good inherited the throne of Norway, because when Olav Haraldsson died, he had no children from his main wife, the queen, but he had one child from his concubine. So that child, Magnus, from the concubine, became king of Norway at just about 12 years old. So we definitely have many examples of men taking concubines, getting them pregnant. I'm not aware of any records of women taking male concubines, or even women concubines having children from two different men. We have a couple examples of a married woman sleeping with another man. This is kind of a difficult subject because the sources are not really clear on it, if she did this willingly or if she was had herself forced upon. Grape. I did a whole video on those sources that you can decide on yourself after you watch that, whether those were consensual or not. Either way, if a married woman let another man in between her legs, the result was lifelong shame that she would never recover from, and the women were very, very aware of this at the time. Again, I cover all those sources in that video. Also, what you will notice, aside from the laws, we have almost no examples of a free woman having a child out of wedlock. It's almost exclusively slave women in every example. Especially in the Icelandic sagas, where there really were no kings or a high, really, really powerful chieftains that would get a high-class concubine, okay? So pretty much the only women that would even consider having sex outside of marriage in those sources, the Icelandic sagas, the sagas of regular day-to-day life, the only women there having sex out of wedlock were slaves. Why? Well, first, it's because they had no choice. Yeah, that's horrible. And it wasn't consensual most of the time. It's even recorded in the oldest law code that a man had the right to buy slaves till karnadet, for sexual intercourse. And it seems like the slaves and even a man's guest would have the right to bang a slave on the property if he wanted. It's all dependent on social class here. So slaves, they were not expected to have any honor anyway. They were not expected to have any positive reputation. That's why slaves were pretty much the only ones who lived promiscuous lives, but also it's because they had no choice. It's pretty messed up that slaves were treated that way, but it goes to show you the view of sex and promiscuity in the Viking Age, okay? Only the lowest class of people got ran through, okay? But any woman or man who cared about their reputation would not be just having sex with anyone. But also, it's the fact that the slave was taken care of, okay? If she got pregnant, she was already a slave. She didn't have to worry about providing for herself financially. Her owner paid all the bills, fed her and housed her and all those things. This is why it would be even more unlikely that an honorable free woman would be any kind of promiscuous and have sex out of wedlock. Not only would sex out of wedlock bring shame onto a good reputation of a free woman, but no free woman would be that stupid to willingly spread their legs for free without any guarantee of support if there was a pregnancy. No, only modern women have grown to live like this because of the invention of something called birth control and child support, but these were not options 1,000 years ago. This is just something we need to wrap our modern brains around before we start getting offended and thinking our ancestors were barbaric. Alright, enough bullying the ladies, I'm done. Let's talk about man-hoes here. So although women were definitely shamed for being promiscuous, men not so much. Okay, like any other place in history, and you guys all know this is just what men do. We have many skaldic poems that celebrate Vikings sleeping with all the women of a place after they raided it or conquered the place and killed the men. It's not right, it's not fair, it's just what we do. Men brag about having sex with women. They brag about the number of women they bag and how hot she was, okay? This has always been done in history. But in actual practicality, outside of war, during peacetime in the Viking Age, the only men who could really afford multiple women were the highest class of men. The kings, chieftains, or even just wealthy landowners. Maybe they weren't as shamed for it as the women were, but we can definitely probably say they had a raging case of syphilis. Nevertheless, some men were definitely man-hoes. The biggest one, by far, most infamous, was Håkon the Jarl. Now, Håkon was basically a rock star. He was just a chieftain, but he had saved Norway multiple times. He had won every battle, won the hearts of the whole country. Håkon was effectively the king of Norway. And what he did was he abused his reputation, because every girl wanted to marry him, and all their fathers wanted their daughter to marry Håkon. So Håkon basically sent out invitations to all the hottest chicks in Norway, all the most powerful chieftains' daughters. He invited them all, come speak of a marriage, let's talk about it. And he ended up just banging them for a few days and then sent them home. And this act of doing this over and over and over again turned Håkon from the most loved man in Norway to the most hated, and it led to his downfall. Why? Well, sure, it was because he lied about a marriage in order to sleep with them, so he pissed off the chieftains, but it wasn't the lying that was the worst part. It was because now these women he slept with were tainted. They were no longer women's. He had banged all the hottest women in Norway, and the whole country knew he did it. So a lot of people were very pissed off about that. And their fathers were pissed because the daughters were the highest class of women that warranted the highest class of men as husbands. But after they had been used by Håkon, their value went down, and it would make it harder for them to find a good husband. You see, it wasn't that the top dog Håkon in Norway banged a bunch of women and they hated him for that. Every king banged multiple women. It's that Håkon banged all the most noble and high-class women and tainted their honor and their ability to find another high-quality mate. The high-class, noble women were expected not to let themselves be used, even by a rock star like Håkon. And that is if they wanted to keep their good reputation and honor at least. So think about that, ladies, next time a rapper or pro athlete slides into your DMs. On the other hand, to further prove the point, another absolute hoe of a man, King Harald Fairhair. He was also a dog that had almost 30 kids with many different women. The difference was Harald knew his priorities. He also knew how to keep the women separate, and he was able to maintain honor and respect from his country. He knew the place that each woman had, okay? Harald had a few wives, but they were kind of from all different places, different regions around the country. Some women he banged were just slaves, some were just peasants. The higher class women he slept with, though, he would have to marry them in order to have sex with them. An official marriage, by the way, seems to be only recognized and accepted by society at the time if the traditional payment was made. Mundir, it was called in Old Norse, which would be could be done both ways, usually in the Viking Age from the man to the woman's family, but in previous times in the Germanic tribes it was actually the woman's family to the man. Anyway, Harald took a wife that was named Snæfríður, who was a Finn. I mentioned that story earlier. And he had a couple of other different wives from different parts of Norway. And according to the sources, he even had 9 wives at the same time. They weren't all living together, right? They weren't all living in his palace like some Arab sheik, but they were all living in different kind of places and regions. That's where they came from, at different places in Scandinavia. Eventually, Harald took his real main wife from Denmark, who was Princess Ragnhild, and that was his real main chick, that he apparently broke it off and divorced all his other previous marriages to get with this highest class princess of Denmark. So Harald made it work somehow. Luckily for him, you know, the gods fate it. His wives didn't live very long, most of them. A couple of his wives died very young after giving him a few kids, so that made it easier to remarry. But then Harald had his concubines, for example, the most famous one, Gesta Danorum, and he had 5 children with her. This one is the story you all know. Gesta didn't want to marry Harald until he was king of all Norway. So then Harald made this famous promise that he would not cut his hair until he became king. And that's where his name comes from, Harald Fair Hair. Then later on, after he becomes the powerful king, Gesta comes crawling back. Oh, now all of a sudden you want to get married, the Harald says. Oh, okay, you know, we can bang, but you are going to be a concubine. Side chick status is all you get. So that kind of thing. Kings and high status men could be hoes and take multiple wives. It wasn't exactly encouraged. It's not something that people would have appreciated. But with a little creativity and some luck and under certain circumstances, you could make it work like Harald did. But this is definitely an outlying case. It wasn't just kings or chieftains though. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes we find a regular man taking not multiple wives, but taking concubines on the side. It's not even really regular men. It was more wealthy landowners. Like in Laxdaela Saga, for example, a man named Olav was married, and he had a concubine on the side that gave him a son named Hoskul, and Olav was actually very proud of him, and he cut him into the inheritance with all of his children from his main wife, okay? So men being hoes. And of course, slavery, like I mentioned, slave owners were free to bang their slave women and nobody batted an eye at it. Okay, it doesn't seem fair. Women could barely even remarry and still keep their honor. 2 sexual partners in a woman's lifetime in the Viking Age would have been a lot. And men could keep as many as they could handle and afford, basically. Yeah, but only the men with money and status, wealth, like kings, chieftains, landowners, lords. The regular average peasant was not out sleeping with a bunch of girls. Why? Well, it's because no girl wanted him, okay? He didn't have enough money and status. So the regular average man in the Viking Age would have probably had one partner, maybe even been a virgin that had to settle for slaves or prostitutes if he was on his travels abroad. So that's not exactly fair either, is it? Women couldn't just sleep around with no shame like men could, but at the same time, women didn't have to secure any wealth or status to find a mate. They could find one just for being themselves, while the men had to struggle and reach a certain status to even get a woman to notice them. Life's not fair, that's just the way it is. There are double standards everywhere. So you want the truth about promiscuity in the Viking Age? Well, it's probably the same as today and the same as all other times in history. Genetic research has shown all throughout the history of the world, of all the people who have reproduced, 80% of women have reproduced on average, and only 40% of men ever in history have reproduced. Why? I don't know, it's probably the same reason as today. On Tinder and dating apps, the top 20% of men are getting the 80% of the women. It's because women are sharing the same dudes of the highest status. And yes, men of the highest status were able to have multiple women without the shame attached to it. Women definitely did not have that same luxury. And yeah, most average men in the Viking Age probably didn't even get any female companionship. That's just the reality. It's not right. It's not fair. The world's not fair. It's filled with double standards. My point is that sex in the Viking Age was viewed very similar as sex throughout any other time in history, whether it's Christian or Muslim or pagan from wherever in the world. Humans are all kind of the same when it regards those types of things. It's only today, with condoms and birth control and brainwashing from the media encouraging promiscuous behavior, that has changed our modern minds. Final conclusions though, as usual, my views are all about freedom. Don't get angry at me. Go sleep with whoever you want. I don't care. That's nobody's business what you do in the bedroom. But I think it's absolutely valuable. Saving yourself for marriage is very honorable. It's not just a Christian thing. It's a human thing. Because like it or not, you know, who you have sex with is nobody's business except maybe a future husband or wife. It might be their business and they might have an opinion on it. That's all I'll say about that. And yeah, there is nothing wrong with saving yourself for marriage, and it's really just sick in the modern day that we even go as far as making fun and bullying young women and men who are saving themselves for marriage, and we need to, that's the only thing I would change, that we need to stop doing as a society. Stop belittling people because they have more honor and sexual impulse control than we do. That's all I have to say about that, and yeah, it has nothing to do with Christianity versus pagan beliefs. It is a human, aspect of our lives. But that's all I have to say for today. Thank you for watching the whole thing. Vi ses nästa gång.